Thank you for joining me as we continue to look at this question of what legitimates the authority of our public officials. As Christians, we get the idea that all authority rests in God, but the question is, how do particular persons in various forms of government become clothed with that authority so that it's legitimate? I'm reminded in this inquiry of what C.S. Lewis wrote about not having a good doctrine of God. Is he said, it's not that people won't have a theology, they won't have thoughts about God, but they'll just have lots of muddled ones because they don't have a clear doctrine of God, and they'll probably find that the thoughts they have of God are those that real theologians considered centuries before and rejected. And what I found in my own experience was that I didn't have a strong doctrine of God, so I therefore did not have a strong doctrine of man. And because of that, I had lots of muddled thinking about the legitimacy of civil government's authority. And today I want to address that because I see a lot of the same muddled thinking out there that was true of me. And I want to then look at what we see and compare it to something Abraham Kuyper said that I think is fundamentally important. So first, I want to begin with a young man who wrote a commentary on Romans 13, and he got it right, praise God, about authorities in God, but he says, so how do these truths play out in our lives as respects our right to vote? And he writes at the end of the article, in the United States, the Constitution delegates authority to the citizenry. We hold in ourselves political power through the electoral process. Therefore, we must act in accordance with the obligations imposed on civil magistrates because we are wielding God-ordained authority, subject to his all-encompassing power. I'm not sure I understand what's being said there, and at least in my mind, that's muddled thinking. It's muddled in my mind. But more clearly stated are some propositions made in this Apologetic for Liberty, a monograph written by a gentleman here in Tennessee, a professing Christian, not calling into question Christianity, but just the accuracy of his thinking on this question of what legitimates public authority. He writes this, nowhere does God grant permission or give directives to rule over or subdue another man without his consent. Now, if that were the only place this were said, I would say, well, maybe he just made a mistake. But he repeats the idea later on, we are not subservient to the claims and demands of co-equal image bearers unless we voluntarily submit. Well, I'm sure that's quite a shock to God because he established kings and rulers and put his people under their authority, and nobody got to vote on anything or consent to anything. So that can't be right. And Abraham Kuyper addresses this. You see, we live in such a climate of opinion of popular sovereignty that we think we create authority. So here's what he writes. He says, I know that popular choice gains the day where no other rule exists or where the existing rule falls away. So, for example, where no other rule exists, we create the state of Israel. We get to vote. We decide people can vote on their leaders, right? Or when Saddam Hussein is toppled, we go in and we establish a right to vote. But he says of that God has the sovereign power in the way of his dispensing providence to take from a people this most desirable condition or never bestow it at all when a nation is unfit for it or by its sin has utterly forfeited the blessing. So if you increasingly feel like your vote doesn't matter, maybe that's why. God is deciding we're not fit any longer because of our sin to actually choose our rulers. And we will be given the Bidens and the Trumps and the Clintons and the Obamas. But he says, but that's not the only way that God distributes his authority to rulers. He says the historical development of a people shows as a matter of course in what other ways authority is bestowed. From the right of inheritance, kings, right? From a hard-fought war. It may proceed from electors, as it did in the German Empire. It may assume a variety of forms because there's an endless difference in the development of nations. A form of government like your own, referring to the United States, could not exist one day in China. It's got a different historical development in the plans and purposes of God. But he said all of this, though, is determined and appointed by God through the hidden counsel of his providence. Because we don't see the providence of God, that in him we live and move and have our being, and everything is in God, we think we have created an authority by consent. And to this point, Kuyper says something that harkens us back to what Lewis said about we'll come up with ideas that real theologians rejected centuries ago. He writes this: in politics, we've been taught that the human element, here the people, may not be considered as the principal thing, so that God is only dragged in to help. In other words, we have consented to the idea that authority is derived by consent, and we have to consent, and we get to form our own governments, and we bring God in, drag him in to give some legitimacy to our vain imaginations and vain thoughts about how God extends his authority to the persons in office.